Robert Thorne stood at his kitchen window, watching the late October rain trace patterns down the glass. His reflection, graying temples, stern jawline, eyes that had seen too many balance sheets and not enough sunsets, stared back at him. The clock on his wall marked 11:47 p.m., each tick echoing through his meticulously organized home like a countdown to chaos. His nephew Tom would arrive any minute now. The phone call from his sister Marie had come 3 hours ago, her voice cracking with that familiar mixture of worry and exhaustion he'd grown to expect whenever Tom was involved. "He's been evicted, Robert. I don't know what happened with his roommates, but he needs somewhere to stay. Just for a few weeks, until he gets back on his feet." Robert's fingers tightened around his coffee mug. 25 years as a senior accountant had taught him that numbers don't lie, but people do. And Tom, brilliant, charming, perpetually troubled Tom, had made an art form of bending the truth. The doorbell rang, its chime shattering the quiet like a stone through glass. Tom stood on the doorstep, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his usual easy smile somehow strained at the edges. Water dripped from his dark hair, and Robert noticed the designer sneakers that seemed at odds with someone who'd just been evicted. "Uncle Rob," Tom said, stepping forward for an awkward hug that Robert reluctantly returned. "Thanks for this. I know it's not ideal." 2 weeks, Robert replied, moving aside to let him in. "That's what we agreed on with your mother." Tom's smile flickered. "Of course. I've got some promising leads on apartments already." Robert led him to the guest room, taking note of how Tom's eyes darted around the house, lingering on the artwork, the electronics, the small signs of comfortable living that Robert had earned through decades of careful planning and harder work. "Bathrooms down the hall," Robert explained, his voice clipped and professional, as if briefing a junior associate. "I leave for work at 7:30 sharp. The spare key's on the kitchen counter, but I expect you to be job hunting during business hours." "Actually," Tom brightened, pulling out his phone, "I've been developing this system for online trading. The algorithms are pretty sophisticated, and I've got some investors interested." "No." Robert cut him off. "Real job, Tom. With a steady paycheck and benefits. The kind where you show up, do honest work, and build something legitimate." Something dark flickered behind Tom's eyes, there and gone so quickly Robert almost missed it. "Sure, Uncle Rob. Whatever you say." Later that night, Robert sat in his home office, reviewing quarterly projections but finding his attention drawn to the muffled sounds of Tom moving around the guest room. He pulled up his banking app, double-checking that his accounts were secure. A habit born from years of watching others make costly mistakes. The next morning, Robert found Tom already in the kitchen, dressed surprisingly well in pressed chinos and a button-down shirt. "Made coffee," Tom said, sliding a mug across the counter. "French press, the way you like it." Robert took a cautious sip. Perfect strength, with just a hint of chicory, exactly how he preferred it. Tom had always been observant, especially about the small details that could win people over. "I've got some interviews lined up," Tom continued, his tone casual but his eyes carefully watching Robert's reaction. "Tech startups, mainly. They like my background in algorithmic trading." Robert nodded, non-committal. "Just remember what we discussed." Over the next few days, a routine developed. Tom would leave the house dressed for success, returning in the evenings with stories of promising interviews and potential opportunities. He kept the guest room tidy, did his own laundry, and seemed to be making a genuine effort to prove himself responsible. But small things began to nag at Robert's attention. The way Tom's phone would buzz at odd hours of the night. The hushed conversations he'd catch snippets of through the walls. The nervous energy that seemed to radiate from his nephew whenever the mail arrived. Then came the first notification from his credit card company, unusual activity detected. A series of transactions at online gambling sites, each just under the reporting threshold. Robert's stomach clenched as he pulled up his account details. The charges had started 3 days after Tom's arrival. That evening, Robert sat in his darkened office, the glow of his computer screen illuminating his face as he methodically documented every transaction, every discrepancy. His hands trembled slightly as he typed, not from fear but from a cold, growing anger. He'd seen this pattern before, in audit after audit. The small violations that grew into larger ones. The careful testing of boundaries. The calculated risk of taking advantage of someone's trust. His phone buzzed, another credit card alert. Outside his office, he heard Tom's footsteps in the hallway, followed by the soft click of the guest room door. Robert opened his desk drawer, pulling out the spare key he'd given his nephew. In the dim light, it seemed to mock him with its implicit trust. Tomorrow, he decided, he would confront Tom. But tonight, he needed to understand just how deep this betrayal went. Robert didn't sleep that night, his mind racing with calculations of a different sort, not of money, but of trust, family obligation, and the weight of past debts both financial and emotional. As dawn broke, he heard Tom leaving early, unusually quiet in his movements. The morning mail brought an envelope that made Robert's blood run cold, a cash advance statement, with his name but an address he didn't recognize. The game was about to change, and Robert knew with crushing certainty that this was only the beginning. The pounding on Robert's front door came at 2:17 a.m., each thunderous impact reverberating through the house like a hammer striking his spine. He jolted awake, his heart racing, years of financial prudence making him instantly alert to threat. The digital clock's red numbers seemed to pulse in the darkness, marking time in a world suddenly off its axis. Through his bedroom window, he could make out 3 silhouettes on his front porch, broad-shouldered figures that spoke of purpose rather than welcome. The pounding came again, and this time a voice cut through the night, "Mr. Thorne. We know you're home. This conversation happens now, one way or another." Robert's hand trembled as he reached for his phone, but before he could dial 911, he heard Tom's door opening. His nephew's footsteps moved quickly down the hallway, not toward the front door, but toward the back of the house. Running. In that moment, something crystallized in Robert's mind. He'd seen this pattern before, in countless audits, the flight response of someone who knew exactly what storm was breaking. His nephew's recent behavior, the late-night calls, the nervous glances at the mail, the too careful explanations of his daily activities, suddenly formed a clear and damning picture. Final warning, Mr. Thorne. The voice had an edge now, professional but with undertones that made Robert's skin crawl. This debt isn't going away, and neither are we. Robert found himself moving toward the door, years of dealing with difficult clients taking over. His hand settled on the doorknob, and he drew himself up, summoning the presence he'd used in countless boardroom confrontations. The men on his porch wore dark suits that might have passed for professional if not for the hour and the barely contained menace in their postures. The leader, a square-jawed man with a Bluetooth earpiece, stepped forward with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Thorne. I'm Marcus Webb from Apex Collections. We're here about the $150,000 you borrowed through our premium lending service." The amount hit Robert like a physical blow. "I never." Webb held up a tablet, displaying loan documentation with Robert's signature, or what appeared to be his signature, at the bottom. "All the paperwork's in order, Mr. Thorne. Including the rather detailed personal information you provided. Mother's maiden name, first car, name of your childhood pet, very thorough responses to our security questions." All information Tom would have known, Robert realized, his stomach churning. Information shared over family dinners, in quiet moments, in the false intimacy of trusted relationships. "Where's your nephew, Mr. Thorne?" Webb's question carried knowing weight. "Tom's been making some interesting promises about repayment. Got himself in a bit deep at some of our associated establishments. Claimed his uncle, you, would be good for it. Even provided all your relevant details as collateral, you might say." Robert's professional mask cracked. "Tom. Get out here now. Silence answered him, broken only by the distant sound of the back door closing. Webb's smile widened fractionally. Ah. Gone, is he? They usually are, at this point. But here's the thing, Mr. Thorne, Tom's not our concern anymore. You are. Your signature, your information, your debt. And we'll need to discuss payment arrangements. Tonight. This is fraud, Robert said, his voice steadier than he felt. I'll contact the authorities. With what proof? Webb's tone remained conversational, but his eyes hardened. Documentation all looks legitimate. Security questions all correctly answered. And let's be honest, do you really want the kind of attention a formal investigation would bring? To your reputation? To your family? We found that quiet resolution usually works best for everyone. Robert's mind raced through scenarios, calculations, possibilities. In the distance, he heard a car engine start, Tom making his escape, leaving his uncle to face the consequences of his betrayal. 24 hours, Webb continued, checking his watch as if this were a normal business meeting. That's how long you have to begin making this right. After that, well. He shrugged, letting the implications hang in the air. We'll be in touch. After they left, Robert stood in his darkened living room, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him like a physical force. His phone buzzed, a text from Tom, I'm sorry. I can explain everything. Just need time to make this right. Robert stared at the message until the screen went dark, reflecting his own haunted expression. In the morning, he would need to start damage control, calling his bank, his lawyer, beginning the arduous process of documenting the fraud. But for now, he simply stood in the darkness, letting the full magnitude of his nephew's betrayal wash over him. His phone buzzed again, another message from Tom, they're not who they say they are, Uncle Rob. Don't give them anything. I'll fix this. Robert's laugh held no humor as he typed back a single word, how? The response came quickly, I know things about their operation. Things they don't want getting out. Just don't pay them anything until I contact you again. Robert turned off his phone, his mind already shifting from shock to analysis. In the quiet of his violated home, he began to plan. Whatever game Tom was playing, whatever web he'd woven, Robert would find a way through it. He had to, his entire life's work now hung in the balance. As dawn began to creep over the horizon, Robert sat at his desk, methodically documenting everything he could remember about Tom's behavior over the past weeks. Every conversation, every odd moment, every detail that might prove relevant. He'd built his career on finding patterns in chaos, and now he would use those same skills to unravel this nightmare. The morning light revealed something Tom had left behind in his hasty departure, a crumpled piece of paper with a series of numbers and what looked like coded references. Robert smoothed it out carefully, his trained eye already beginning to see potential significance in the patterns. Whatever game Tom was playing, he'd chosen the wrong opponent. Robert had spent his life understanding how money moved, how paper trails worked, how people tried to hide their tracks. Now, he would use every bit of that knowledge to protect himself, and perhaps, though he wasn't ready to admit it yet, to save his nephew from whatever darkness had consumed him. His phone buzzed one final time, an alert from his bank about another attempted charge. The game wasn't over, it was just beginning. Morning light filtered through the blinds of Jerome Marshall's law office, casting parallel shadows across Robert's clasped hands. The leather chair creaked beneath him as he leaned forward, his voice steady despite the sleepless night behind him. I want to know my options, Jerome. All of them. The lawyer's office felt like a confessional, its wood-paneled walls absorbing Robert's careful recitation of events. Jerome, a friend of 20 years, listened with the patient attention that had made him one of the city's most respected attorneys, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light as he nodded. Legally speaking, this is straightforward, Jerome said, spreading out the documents Robert had brought. Identity theft, fraud, unauthorized use of personal information. With your documentation, we could have Tom arrested within hours. The word arrested hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Robert closed his eyes, and unbidden, a memory surfaced, Tom at 7 years old, falling asleep against his shoulder during a long car ride, trusting and innocent. The same shoulder that had carried Tom's father, Robert's brother James, to his final rest 12 years ago. Before you decide, Jerome continued, his tone softening, there's something else you should know. I made some calls this morning about Apex collections. They're not just aggressive collectors, Robert. There are investigations ongoing, money laundering, connections to offshore gambling operations. Tom may be in deeper trouble than simple fraud. Robert's fingers traced the edge of his brother's old watch, worn now on his own wrist. James had given it to him the night Robert's first business venture failed, along with a check that saved him from bankruptcy. Everyone deserves one save, James had said. The trick is learning from it. What would you do? Robert asked, looking up at his old friend. If it were your nephew? Jerome removed his glasses, polishing them thoughtfully. I'd remember that legal solutions and right solutions aren't always the same thing. But Robert, whatever you're considering, be careful. These people play by different rules. The drive home gave Robert time to think, memories washing over him like waves. James had always been the family protector, the one who understood that money was just numbers, but family was irreplaceable. Now, with James gone, that mantle had passed to Robert, a responsibility he'd perhaps taken too literally, focusing on financial stability while missing the deeper currents of his nephew's struggles. His sister Marie's voice broke through his reverie via the car's Bluetooth. He called me, Rob. He's scared. He should be, Robert replied, but the anger that had fueled him through the night felt hollow now. There's something I need to tell you, Marie's voice cracked slightly. About what happened last year, when Tom dropped out of grad school. I knew about the gambling. I thought I could handle it myself, protect him like James would have. Robert pulled over, his hands gripping the steering wheel. What are you saying, Marie? He got in trouble then too. I paid off some debts, made him promise to get help. He did, for a while. Went to meetings, saw a counselor. But then he lost his job, and with the pressure of the rent. She paused. I should have told you. But I kept hearing James in my head, saying how family protects family. The irony wasn't lost on Robert, everyone trying to protect everyone else, and all of them failing. He thought of the numbers on Tom's crumpled paper, seeing them now not just as evidence, but as a cry for help written in the only language his nephew truly understood. Where is he now? Robert asked. He wouldn't tell me. Said it was safer if I didn't know. But Rob, he mentioned something about having proof, about the people he owes money to. Said they're using the debt collection agency to clean money from their gambling operations. Robert's analytical mind began connecting dots, Tom's algorithmic trading background, the coded numbers, his cryptic warning about knowing things they didn't want revealed. His nephew hadn't just fallen into their web, he'd found a way to track their operations. That evening, Robert sat in James's old leather armchair, one of the few pieces of furniture he'd kept after his brother's death. On the coffee table lay 2 items, Jerome's drafted criminal complaint against Tom, and an old photo of James teaching Tom how to fish, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Uncle Rob, I can prove where their money really comes from. But I need access to your work computers. They've been using legitimate businesses as fronts. Once I show you, you'll understand. Robert stared at the message, years of professional caution warring with the echo of his brother's voice, everyone deserves one save. But James had never faced anything like this, international gambling operations, money laundering, threats wrapped in legal paperwork. Another text arrived, meeting tomorrow night. I'll show you everything. But we have to move fast, they're starting to suspect I saved the records. Robert picked up the photo, studying his brother's face. James had always seen the best in people, believed in second chances. But he'd also been practical, understanding that true help sometimes meant making hard choices. The next text made his blood run cold. "They're asking about your firm's client lists now. I think they want more than just money." Robert set down the photo and picked up his phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. Whatever he decided now would set an irreversible course. Help Tom and risk everything, or protect himself and lose the last connection to his brother's legacy of protection and redemption. In the growing darkness, the choice loomed before him, each option casting long shadows over his carefully ordered life. The corporate office building stood silent in the evening light, its windows reflecting the setting sun like sheets of burning gold. Robert sat in his car, watching shadows lengthen across the parking lot, his hands resting on the steering wheel where he'd been frozen for the past 20 minutes. The weight of his security badge seemed to grow heavier in his pocket with each passing moment. What Tom was asking, access to the firm's systems, wasn't just illegal. It was a violation of everything Robert had built his life around: trust, integrity, the careful stewardship of others' financial futures. Yet here he sat, contemplating exactly that, the echo of James's voice mixing with his own professional instincts in a discordant chorus. His phone lit up with Webb's number for the third time that day. He let it ring, watching the screen until it went dark. Their courtesy calls had grown more frequent, each one carrying subtle threats wrapped in professional courtesy. The last message had mentioned his firm's upcoming audit schedule, information they shouldn't have had access to. The sound of car doors closing nearby drew his attention. Through his rearview mirror, he caught sight of two men in dark suits walking toward the building's entrance. Something about their purposeful stride sent a chill down his spine. They moved like Webb's men, that same contained menace barely hidden beneath a veneer of professionalism. Robert's phone buzzed again. "Tom, this time, are you here? Don't go inside. They're watching the building." For a moment, Robert felt the familiar surge of anger at his nephew's manipulation. But it faded as quickly as it came, replaced by a strange calm. He'd spent his career tracking money, understanding its flow through the legitimate business world. If what Tom suggested was true, if these people were using legitimate businesses to clean their gambling profits, then perhaps it was time to use that knowledge differently. His fingers moved across the phone's screen. "Tell me everything you know." "Not here. Not at the office. But I need the full truth." The response came quickly: "Holiday Inn, room 422. 1 hour. Come alone, and make sure you're not followed." Robert started his car, mind already shifting into the analytical patterns that had served him so well over the years. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he noticed the dark sedan that eased into traffic 3 cars behind him. Amateur move, they should have waited longer before following. The next 45 minutes became an improvised course in counter-surveillance. Robert drew on decades of financial forensics work, understanding that money and people left similar trails when they wanted to hide. He took random turns, doubled back on side streets, and finally pulled into a crowded shopping center, walking through a department store and out another entrance where he called a rideshare. The Holiday Inn rose before him like a monument to mediocrity, its fluorescent lights harsh against the darkening sky. Room 422 was at the end of a long hallway, the worn carpet muffling his footsteps. He knocked twice, then once more, the pattern Tom had specified in a follow-up text. The door opened a crack, chain still in place. "You weren't followed?" "I'm not an amateur, Tom," Robert replied, surprising himself with the steady calm in his voice. "But right now, I need you to be straight with me. No more games, no more half-truths." Inside, the room looked like a command center designed by someone who'd watched too many thriller movies. Tom's laptop was surrounded by papers covered in numbers and diagrams. A second screen showed what looked like financial tracking software, similar to what Robert used at work, but with modifications he didn't recognize. "I found patterns in their operations," Tom began, his usual smooth confidence replaced by a focused intensity. The gambling sites, the collection agency, the way they move money through legitimate businesses. It's all connected, but they made mistakes. Small ones, but. Like targeting an accountant's nephew? Robert interrupted. Or was that part of their plan? Tom's face fell. I thought I could beat their system. My algorithms were working, until they weren't. But then I started seeing the patterns, how they pick their targets, how they use debt to gain leverage over people with access to legitimate financial channels. He turned his laptop, showing Robert a complex diagram of money flows. They're not just after your money, Uncle Rob. They want access to your firm's client accounts. Clean money they can mix with their gambling profits, making everything look legitimate. Robert studied the screen, his professional expertise spotting details Tom had missed. You have proof of all this? Enough to hurt them. But they know I have it, which is why. A sharp knock at the door cut him off. Both men froze, staring at the entrance. Mr. Thorne. Webb's voice carried through the door with practiced ease. We thought it was time for a proper conversation. All of us, together. Family style. Robert looked at Tom, seeing not the confident scammer of recent weeks, but the scared boy who'd once clung to his father at thunderstorms. In that moment, he made his decision, not from guilt or obligation, but from a place of clarity he hadn't felt since this began. Send everything you have to my secure email, he whispered. Then wipe your drives. All of them. Another knock, harder this time. Last chance for a civilized discussion, gentlemen. Robert straightened his tie, a lifetime of boardroom confrontations settling into his bones. It was time to stop reacting and start controlling the game. He had skills these people hadn't counted on, and now, finally, he understood exactly how to use them. The door hinges creaked as the first blow struck them. In the tense silence of his study, Robert watched dawn creep across his desk, painting his brother's old watch in shades of gold. The events at the hotel had left him changed, not broken, but reconstructed. Like a balance sheet after careful reconciliation, everything was clearer now, each asset and liability precisely understood. The encrypted drive Tom had pressed into his hands during their escape sat before him, a small black rectangle containing enough evidence to destroy lives, or save them. Robert traced its edges with a finger, remembering the look in Webb's eyes when the hotel room door finally gave way. It wasn't the violence that had surprised him, but the flash of uncertainty when Webb realized his targets weren't as helpless as expected. You're sure about this? Marie's voice came softly through his phone speaker. She'd been on the line for an hour, listening as Robert outlined his plan. Not the desperate scheme of a cornered man, but something more deliberate, crafted from decades of understanding how money and power truly worked. James would have given him another chance, Robert said, his voice steady. But he would have done it smart, not just from the heart. James isn't here, Marie replied, a familiar grief coloring her words. And you're not him, Rob. You can't save everyone. No, Robert agreed, opening his laptop to review the evidence Tom had collected. But I can make sure the right people face the right consequences. The documents told a story that only someone with Robert's expertise could fully appreciate. Tom hadn't just stumbled onto their operation. His algorithmic trading background had helped him spot patterns that even the criminals themselves might not have recognized. Money flowing through shell companies, legitimate businesses unknowingly serving as laundering fronts, and at the center, a web of gambling debts used to compromise key people in financial institutions. Robert's phone buzzed with a text from Jerome, meeting set with FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Are you certain about this approach? The question gave Robert pause. His original plan, turning over everything to the authorities, would have been cleaner, safer. But it wouldn't have addressed the deeper issue, Tom's need for redemption, and Robert's own journey from victim to architect of justice. Proceed as discussed, he typed back. But make sure our leverage is clear. They need to understand exactly what we know, and what we're willing to do with that information. The next message came from Tom, using the secure channel they'd established. Uncle Rob, they're making moves. 3 more targets identified at different firms. Same pattern. Robert allowed himself a small smile. Webb's organization was behaving exactly as he'd predicted, escalating their operations in an attempt to establish new channels before their existing ones were compromised. It was the same pattern he'd seen countless times in audits when companies tried to hide their troubles. He began typing his response to Tom, then paused, remembering James's voice. The trick isn't just knowing the truth, it's understanding when to reveal it. Instead of sending the message, Robert reached for his phone and dialed a number he'd been holding in reserve. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Mr. Thorne, Webb said, professional menace tapering his words. I was wondering when you'd call. I want to make a deal, Robert replied, years of negotiation experience steadying his tone. Not about the money, that's trivial. This is about something bigger. Interesting. Webb's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. And what makes you think you're in a position to negotiate? Robert glanced at his laptop screen, where financial patterns danced like constellations waiting to be interpreted. Because I understand what you're really doing. Not just the how, but the why. And more importantly, I know what you've overlooked. A pause, heavy with calculation. Continue. Not over the phone, Robert said. Tomorrow, noon. The conference room at Meridian Trust. Bring your actual employers, the ones who think they've hidden their connections so well. I'll bring something they need to see. After hanging up, Robert sent a series of carefully worded messages, to Jerome, to Tom, to certain board members whose trust he'd earned over decades. Each message was a thread in a larger tapestry, a pattern that would only become clear when all the pieces were in place. As night settled over the city, Robert stood at his kitchen window, where this had all begun. The reflection that gazed back at him was different now, not just an accountant, not just an uncle seeking redemption for a troubled nephew, but someone who had found a new kind of strength in the intersection of knowledge and necessity. His phone buzzed one final time, a message from Tom containing a single line of code, the key to unlocking the encrypted drive's most damaging contents. Trust freely given, but now bounded by understanding and purpose. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own necessary calculations. But for now, Robert allowed himself to feel the quiet satisfaction of a strategy well crafted, knowing that the real test still lay ahead. The conference room at Meridian Trust seemed to float above the city, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that had intimidated countless clients over the years. But today, as Robert stood watching the autumn sun paint shadows across neighboring buildings, he felt a strange sense of peace. Not the false calm before a storm, but the quiet certainty of someone who had finally found his true purpose. The encrypted drive sat on the polished conference table like a black hole, drawing all attention toward its devastating potential. Robert had spent the night reviewing its contents one final time, each revelation adding another layer to his understanding of not just Webb's operation, but of his own journey through this crucible of trust and betrayal. "They're here," Tom's voice came through his earpiece, steady despite everything. His nephew was stationed in a cafe across the street, monitoring arrivals through software he'd modified for this purpose. No longer running from consequences, but facing them with newfound clarity. Robert straightened his tie, the familiar gesture carrying the weight of countless negotiations. But this meeting would be different from any he'd conducted in his 30 years of financial work. Today, he wasn't just protecting assets, he was redefining what truly held value. Webb entered first, flanked by 2 men whose expensive suits couldn't quite hide their enforcer bearing. Behind them came 3 others, older, carrying themselves with the entitled confidence of those who believed money could solve any problem. Robert recognized one from his firm's client files, another from charity gala photographs. Men who played at legitimacy while building empires on others' desperation. Quite a dramatic setting, Mr. Thorne, Webb said, his professional smile not quite reaching his eyes. Though I'm surprised you chose such a public venue. Transparency matters in finance, Robert replied, moving to the head of the table. Something I've learned to value even more recently. The oldest of the three leaders, silver-haired, patrician features lined with quiet arrogance, stepped forward. Let's dispense with the theatrics. Marcus says you have something to discuss. Make it worth our time. Robert picked up the encrypted drive, turning it in his hands like a precious stone. This contains everything. The algorithms tracking money through your shell companies. The connection between your gambling operations and legitimate businesses. The way you use debt to compromise key people in financial firms. He paused, meeting each man's gaze in turn. And most importantly, the pattern you didn't even know you were creating. Patterns can be interpreted many ways, the silver-haired man said softly. Or made to disappear entirely. True, Robert acknowledged. But I'm not interested in destruction. I'm offering a different kind of solution. He pressed a button on the conference room phone. Jerome's voice filled the room, all parties present. We are, Robert confirmed. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit has the preliminary documents, Jerome continued. They're quite interested, but willing to explore the alternative arrangement we discussed. Assuming everyone cooperates. Robert watched the shift in the room, subtle tensions, micro-expressions of calculation and concern. These men hadn't built their empire by being predictable victims. They'd survived by recognizing when adaptation was preferable to confrontation. Your organization has a remarkable infrastructure, Robert said, his voice carrying the quiet authority he'd developed over decades. Legitimate businesses, international connections, sophisticated financial networks. All of it could be used differently. Legally. Profitably. He let that sink in before continuing. I'm offering to help you transition, to use my expertise to restructure everything through proper channels. No arrests, no scandal, no collapse of what you've built. Just, evolution. The silver-haired man's eyes narrowed. And in exchange? Tom's debt is cleared. All records of his involvement erased. And you never again use personal information or family connections to compromise financial professionals. Find another way to grow your legitimate operations. Silence filled the room like water, deep and heavy with possibility. Robert could almost see the calculations running behind their eyes, the weighing of risks against rewards, of change against destruction. Your nephew caused us considerable trouble, Webb said, but his tone had shifted from menace to something closer to respect. He showed you your vulnerabilities, Robert corrected. Consider it a valuable service. One that probably saved you from someone less, diplomatically inclined. The silver-haired man studied Robert for a long moment before nodding almost imperceptibly. You'll oversee the transition personally. With full transparency to all relevant authorities. Change doesn't happen in darkness. Later that evening, Robert sat in his brother's old chair, holding James's watch in his palm. The weight of it felt different now, less like a burden of remembrance and more like a connection to something timeless, the complex dance between justice and mercy, between accountability and redemption. Tom's text arrived just before midnight, "Thank you isn't enough. But I'll spend my life earning this second chance." Robert smiled, remembering James's words about everyone deserving one save. But his brother had only been partly right. The real gift wasn't in the saving, it was in finding the wisdom to make that save mean something, to transform it from an ending into a beginning. Outside, the city lights painted patterns across his ceiling, each one a story of darkness and illumination, of falling and rising, of the endless human capacity for transformation. Robert closed his eyes, feeling the quiet triumph of having found his own path through the shadows, emerging not unchanged, but undefeated. The watch ticked softly in his hand, marking time not just in minutes and hours, but in choices made, trust rebuilt, and wisdom hard-won in the crucible of necessary change.